Welcome back to Ozarks tonight. Well, it's hard to believe, but another presidential election cycle is on the way, and Democrats are throwing their names into the hat for 2020 already. Dr. Brian Calfano is joining me today. First of all, Brian, welcome, and kind of what's your take of the names that have thrown their names into the hat so far in 2020 for the Democrats?
You bet. Great to see you, John. You know, I think really you got to look at this field and say, especially for the women who have thrown their hats in, this is an attempt to get as fast a jump on fundraising, name recognition, and political branding as possible without sort of going where no Democrat wants to go, which is to say, we had a female candidate in 2016 that didn't quite work out. And we don't really want to talk too much about that because there's lots of bitter feelings over that whole situation. I think it's smart for these folks to get out in front because if you look at the list, a lot of them lack, in fact, I think all of them essentially lack national name recognition. Harris from California is probably the one who has the largest following of those who have declared at this point outside of Elizabeth Warren. But that's because both Warren and Harris are senators from pretty dominant states. If you're looking at the rest of the lineup, though, at this point, it's a bit shaky. And you kind of wonder, well, then why would somebody even decide they want to get into the race at this point? As you said, John, it's really hard to believe that we're just a couple of years out from inaugurating President Trump, and now we're already starting up with this cycle of exploratory committees being formed, people making their platform positions, lining up donors, doing all the sorts of things that you'd expect them to do. It's actually, I got to tell you, I think a little nauseating for many people watching at home.
Sure. And Elizabeth Warren, a lot of people do recognize her because she has gone back and forth with President Trump before the last election and on and off over the last 2 years. So she's definitely a name some people out there definitely will recognize. A couple other names that are not yet in the race but are very well known on the Democratic side, former Vice President Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, who ran a successful campaign before bowing out to Hillary Clinton last election cycle. Any word on whether those two candidates will run? I know they are both in their mid-70s right now.
Right. You know, 70, though, is, I think, the new 50 for people, right? So whereas years ago it would have been really difficult to imagine somebody running in their mid-70s for president, I don't think you're going to see that same kind of ageism, if you want to call it that, in regard to whoever decides to jump into the ring on the Democratic side this time, because President Trump obviously is in his 70s too, and assuming he runs for re-election, they'll be about the same age. I think in terms of the question over Sanders, it's going to really depend on how well these sexual harassment claims regarding his 2016 campaign operation shake out to his benefit politically. If it looks like there are more accusations coming out, more former staffers admitting responsibility for bad behavior, and if it can be pinned on Sanders that he sort of fostered a culture whereby this sort of behavior was either condoned in some indirect way, or at least Sanders knew of it in some manner and didn't do anything about it or didn't come down hard enough on the issue, it's going to be really hard for him, I think, to energize progressives in the same way that he was able to do in 2016. When it comes to Vice President Biden, I think it's going to be a question of whether or not his past catches up with him. And I don't mean his past in terms of being the vice president. Joe Biden has had a very colorful career as a politician going back to the early 1970s. He had a long history in the United States Senate. He has said and done a lot of things. He has run for president 3 separate times. So a 4th time for him going out there running for president of the United States. I don't know if it's going to be 4 times the charm, and I don't know that donors in the Democratic Party are going to want to take a chance on a guy who's already had 3 shots at it. He has been a steadying voice on the Democratic side. He's been a voice of reason for many moderates and independents in the country from a political standpoint, especially over the last couple of years. But whether that translates into enough enthusiasm for a guy who, by his own accounts, isn't really sure that he has the fire in the belly, so to speak, to make a run at the presidency is something I think a lot of folks are scratching their heads about, wondering going forward. So honestly, if you look at the Democratic landscape and who could end up being a true contender, I think it really speaks to an argument for youth. and for new blood and fresh faces in the Democratic Party. It's almost, if you look out at a lot of the folks who are progressive in this country politically, they are of a certain age and youthful disposition. So when Nancy Pelosi is the House Speaker, second in line after Mike Pence to be President of the United States, certainly wields a lot of political power. She's 78 years old. And you got Chuck Schumer, who's in his late 60s, and the rest of the leadership in the House and the Senate being on the older side. I think it speaks to the need for the Democrats to find somebody who is not just young, but has youthful vigor, if you will, to steal a term that John F. Kennedy used to use. And Kennedy, of course, is sort of like the poster person for vigor in a Democratic campaign, even some 60 years after he ran.
For sure. And when we talk about the Democratic Party, both of these political parties are always evolving depending on who the candidate are and issues that they get behind. As opposed to 2016, where do you think the Democratic platform is kind of evolving to as we head toward 2020? What issues will be most important to them?
That's the really big question. I think everybody is sort of concerned about figuring out what happens with that platform. But honestly, you know, John, it's a great question. The platform, though, really isn't that important. It's something that's symbolic. It's something the party coalesces around to say, these are our values. These are the things that we think as a party are important. But as President Trump has shown, and most presidential candidates have shown over the decades, what the party platform ends up being at the political nominating party convention that goes on in the summer before the general election really doesn't necessarily speak to how the candidate explains his or her views for the country and visions for what they'd want to see happen in terms of policy. And so even though the Democratic base seems to be pushing the party towards a far more liberal or progressive set of viewpoints on things like taxation, on economic growth, on wage distribution, on health care affordability, on access to education, on gun control, on all these sorts of things that a lot of folks in our part of the country really are not very fond of politically. As that progressive moment is happening in the party and that transition is occurring, I don't know that you're going to necessarily get somebody who ends up being the nominee who's going to articulate those views as strongly as some people in the base would want. Because it's always a challenge in American politics. You run either to the right or to the left in the primaries, depending on whether it's the Republican or the Democratic Party, because you got to appeal to those base voters, those conservatives or those liberals who are the true believers, who are going to give you money, who are going to show up to your rallies, who are going to tell folks to go out and vote for you and do all the sorts of things you got to do to run a successful campaign. But it's been essentially political orthodoxy in this country for the last 50 years that at some point you got to run to the middle, and you have to make the case to those who are essentially toss-up voters, people who may have voted for President Obama a few cycles ago but switched to President Trump in 2016 or vice versa. These are people who they want to hear certain things about how you're going to affect their lives and the lives of their children and their communities, but they don't have the same sort of strong tie to ideology or to a political party. And that means moderating your view. Heaven forbid we have a moderate view on things in this country, right? It's almost heresy if you're on the right or the left politically. But a good politician can figure out a way to thread that needle.
Definitely will be an exciting election cycle, no doubt about that. Dr. Brian Calfano, I want to thank you for joining us here tonight.